Welcome to Lesson 10, the Final Solution Part 2. This one looks at the situation for German Jews and follows the story of Operation Reinhardt, the beginning of the mass extermination of the Jewish population of Poland and Central and Western Europe, up to and through Auschwitz. Now, August 1941, radical measures against the German Jewish population step up. Again, all in keeping with Hitler's need or lack thereof to show restraint at this particular point. It becomes illegal for German Jews to voluntarily immigrate by September 1941. All Jews have to wear the infamous Yellow Star of David, which sets them apart from the local population, sort of singles them out for discrimination. Hitler also decrees that month, that is September, that the Reich should be liberated of all Jews. Only exemption in this case was mixed marriages between German and Jewish people, Jews of foreign nationality and those over 65. But by October 1965, Eichmann will begin the transferring of Jews from the east, transferring them to the east to be resettled, so to speak. And in fact, in this case, most German Jews go enthusiastically. After facing increased discrimination, they're told effectively that Eichmann instructs the SS and the people who are doing the resettlement to tell them that they're going to the Ukraine to be settled in the newly conquered territories. And many German Jews actually openly accept this. They pay for their own tickets. They're allowed to take money, 2 suitcases and food. All of their rest of possessions is confiscated and given over to the state to be sold and or redistributed. The sort of voluntary resettlements of German Jews at this particular point are quite popular. In a number of cities across the east, most particularly Lodz, Riga, Minsk, and Kovno, the situation for the Jews who arrived there is horrendous. Of the 20,000 German Jews sent to Lodz, those incapable of work upon arrival were shot almost immediately. The rest of them who weren't were dumped into the ghetto, already overcrowded, as we know, and to die of starvation and disease. And of course, typhoid fever was running rampant in the Lodz ghetto at this particular point. Protests by the authorities in Lodz actually about their inability to take more ended the transportation to that particular city, and only 20,000 end up going there. An additional 25,000 German Jews are sent to Riga, Minsk, and Kovno, and that should actually read 1941, in what is the Ostland territory. The Ostland means Eastland. This is areas taken after the launch of Operation Barbarossa. This is important because this is the area where the Einsatzgruppen was operating. Events here seem to indicate the fate of the Jews was decided, but the timing was not. Some were shot on arrival, some were selected for labor, and sort of there seems to be an unequal or sort of unbalanced treatment of the Jewish population. Einsatzgruppen leaders, in fact, in 1945, say that they were told by Himmler in October of 1941 to kill every last Jew in Ostland. There seem to be some disagreements about the details, but broadly speaking, trains of deportees sent to Ostland are sent to Ostland until the spring of 1942, when Himmler, I suppose, ends executions in this territory in November 1941. I guess a major escalation in the nature of how this genocide is being conducted after the decision had been made, of course, had to do with shooting versus gassing. Himmler visits an SS execution in 1941, and he's troubled by what he sees. He starts to, I guess, worry about the humanity of what's being done here. It's also very important to make the distinction at this point that his version of humanity has absolutely nothing to do with the Jewish population and their concern about what's happening to them. It has everything to do about the psychological stress caused by the people asked to do the killing. So in August of 1941, Himmler commissions SS technical advisors to find a more humane way of killing people. Their first experiment actually is putting people in pits and blowing them up with explosives. As you can imagine, this is gruesome, and it fails because explosives, generally speaking, kill the people in the immediate vicinity, but they don't radiate out so well, and the people on the outside end up being horribly maimed and have to be reshot. Therefore, gas is chosen as a more effective solution. Hitler's chancellery supports this, the choice of using gas greatly, because it allows them to redeploy the trained T4 operatives who were successful in gassing techniques with the mentally handicapped and throughout 1940, 1939. So the initial gassing experiments take place at a place called Helmo in August of 1941, or Helmno, as I think it's pronounced. There is really where the sort of the institutionalized aspects of the final solution kick off. The Lodz ghetto conditions worsen and worsen, and a man named Wilhelm Koppe, he was a police chief for the area, was aware of the thinking in Berlin that there had been a fundamental decision to exterminate the Jewish population of Europe. And he appoints a man named Herbert Lange to find a suitable place for the killing. Helmno is 65 kilometers northwest of Lodz, and this place was chosen. It was chosen mostly because of the territory around it. There was a large mansion that could be converted into barracks, and this mansion was surrounded by a large wooded area, which would be ideal for hiding a mass grave. In December 1941, Helmno gas vans were used to kill Jewish populations. These vans were pulled up, pipes were stuck into the wall, and the people were killed by the injection of carbon monoxide gas once the engines were started. In January 1942, the improvised gas van solution gives way to a more permanent gas chamber, which still uses carbon monoxide gas. By the time Helmno is destroyed in 1943 by the Nazis trying to conceal what was done there, 140,000 people, Jews, Gypsies, Poles, and Russians, are killed there. In the general government, Himmler will, with the directive in his hand and in his mind, will select a man by the name of Odili Golobnik, a hardcore Nazi, originally of Polish descent, who is the Lublin police chief, to oversee the killing of Jews in the area known as general government. It was decided that to hold the mass killings in Poland. Initially, it was hoped that they would do this in the Ostland territory captured from the Russians, but Poland had a better rail system. To do the killing here was easier than sending the Jews further east, where the rail system was poorer, under more strain because of the movements of troops to and from the front. And therefore, Himmler chooses eastern Poland as the place where the final solution will be conducted. Belzec and work begins on the first of 3 sites in November 1942. Auschwitz is relatively small at this particular point. The first gassing experiments will take place there on Russian prisoners in September 1941. And the crucial genocide decision seems to have been made in this case by the end of September 1941 or earlier, based on the nature of what was being done in Auschwitz. While there remained some improvisation, the strands of the extermination seem to be coming together. Where this is in many ways made official government policy, and at least coordinated at the governmental level, was at the Wannsee Conference of 20 January 1942. The RSHA, the Reich Security Detachment, led by Reinhard Heydrich, had a lot of practical problems with the deportations that were beginning to the east in October 1941. He needed to coordinate the rail, labor, finance, and police, I guess, needed or to move thousands of people to Poland. Heydrich himself invited officials from several agencies to Wannsee, which is a suburb of Paris, to meet in the mansion that we see in this picture to discuss these logistical issues. What's, I suppose, surprising when you consider it is that the Wannsee Conference, if you will, lasts only 90 minutes. In those 90 minutes, quick procedures for the movement of 11 million Jews and how they're to be, quote, resettled in the East were formed. Those who were considered fit, it was decided, would be given a temporary reprieve and forced to work, ostensibly to death, in the labor camps. And once they were no longer able to work, they would then be exterminated. The fate of the unfit was not discussed, but certainly implied by the nature of what they talked about, that they were to be massacred immediately. The The man who took the minutes of this meeting was the Austrian Adolf Eichmann, who, as you know, was intimately involved in the Jewish question from the 1930s forward. Eichmann takes relatively vague minutes of these notes, referring to the removal and resettlement of Jews, but said actually later on in his trial in Jerusalem that they were more frank in person. They didn't mince words at the Wannsee Conference, and even though he was careful not to write the words extermination in his notes, these are things that were actively talked about. According to Eichmann, in fact, Heydrich was surprised even how readily accepted his policies and his ideas for the extermination of the Jews were agreed upon. The Wannsee Conference was merely a rubber stamp of things. He expected people to push back, not only on a logistical level, but on a moral level. And he had absolutely no moral pushback or no logistical pushback whatsoever. And the Wannsee Conference ended quite quickly, much to Heydrich's surprise. So I guess in summary, what is the significance of the Wannsee Conference? Well, it is not the moment when the final solution was decided, rather the moment when the final solution was endorsed by a broad section of the German government, not just the SS, who were carrying out the final solution through the Einsatzgruppen and other special police detachments all over the East. It also ensured that the extermination program would become an efficient industrial process rather than an ad hoc, localized killing process as it had been done to this particular point. What the Wannsee Conference leads to is what's known as Operation Reinhardt, named after Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the Reich Security Detachment, who you saw in the previous picture. Heydrich is assassinated by Czech partisans in Prague in 1942, and in fact, the mass gassing of 2 million Jews in the general government, which gathered momentum from the Wannsee Conference on, is given the name Operation Reinhardt in honor of Reinhard Heydrich. The camps that were used in Operation Reinhardt in the early stages of the Holocaust were Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. I'm going to walk you through the organizational process and the process of Operation Reinhardt over the next few slides. What you need to know is that Operation Reinhardt had the oversight, and the responsibility for this was given to the SS. They were responsible for clearing the ghettos, organizing the transportation to the death camps, and to do so, they employed the Jewish Council, the Judenrat, to find people for resettlement. Like the German Jews, the people who volunteered and initially did volunteer for resettlement were quite happy to be leaving the ghetto for a new life in Ukraine. But of course, the rumors of what was happening once they left the camp get back to the ghettos very quickly, and it becomes hard to find volunteers. Initially, they're taking up to 10,000 people a day volunteering to be transported, against their knowledge, of course, to Belzec, Treblinka, or Sobibor. The transportation experience, once they were sort of volunteered or forced to resettle or to be sent to the death camps, was a horrific experience. The families were usually separated from before they got in the coaches. Up to 150 people were packed into the tiny railway freight cars or box cars. These people weren't given food, they weren't given water, they weren't given provision for even basic sanitation. Hundreds would die of disease because of the lack of sanitation, or disease caught from people who were already sick from the horrible conditions of the ghetto. Others would die of suffocation, dehydration, cold temperatures. And many, in fact, were trampled to death as the box cars sort of swayed to and fro, causing 150 people's weight to sort of fall back on each other. People just were simply crushed to death. People who tried to escape, flee through the windows, or run away from the cars were shot on the spot. Each day of Operation Reinhardt, transports carrying up to 25,000 people were sent to the death camps. The killing process, I'm going to apologize for the typo there. The killing process was a little bit, okay, so as I was saying, once the people arrived, the aim of the SS at the camps was to kill everybody, but save for a few who were selected to work almost immediately upon entering. So most would be killed within 2 hours. Efforts and incredibly deceptive, incredibly horrendous efforts were made to deceive the Jews. Terror and speed were the main means of ensuring a smooth operation, but also deception. The extent to which the premeditation of the killings goes, I find incredibly disturbing. Trains stopped, deportees were sort of turned out or hurried out of the freight cars. If you arrived at Treblinka, you saw, when you first arrived, a fake train station, completely fake, made to show that this was only a transit camp. It had signs for a ticket office and a restaurant. Of course, none of this existed. It was simply a ruse to trick the people who were coming in. There was almost always a welcoming speech reassuring that they were at a transit camp before heading to the Ukraine. In fact, this speech was oftentimes given as by the commandant of the camp and done in quite a sadistic way. Males and females were separated upon arriving and herded into barracks to undress. The women and girls had their hair shorn. They were told this was to stop lice because disease and stuff had broken out. But really it was used for other purposes. The most common use of hair shorn from the women and girls at Belzec-Sobibor in Treblinka was to make socks for German submarine crews. And in fact, the majority of socks given to German submarine crews from 1943 onward was made of the hair of victims of the Holocaust. They were then forced into what was known as the tube, which was a long tunnel which led to what they were told, of course, was a shower room. But of course, we know this as the gas chambers. They were told they were going to a bathhouse. They were forced into the tube. Many of them were whipped and clubbed as they were, pushed into this way. And once the sort of bathhouse or gas chamber was full, a big, huge iron door was shut, and a diesel engine pumped in carbon monoxide. After 30 minutes or so, the engine was switched off, and the Jewish Death Brigade, the Sonderkommando as they're known, had the job of sort of going in through the dead bodies, rummaging through them, and finding those with gold teeth, and taking a hammer and knocking the gold teeth out of the people's mouths so that the gold could then be processed and turned over to the German authorities. The burial process was, I suppose, equally as troubling. Initially, the bodies were dumped into a mass grave, but of course, this was inadequate when you consider that 268,000 Jews alone are gassed in Treblinka between July and August 1942. No mass graves big enough, really, to hold this amount of people. Not only the fact that at Treblinka, for instance, the initial mass graves that they started putting people into led to, this is an abominable thought, but what happens when the carbon monoxide gas reacts with decomposing human flesh is that your body starts to swell and bloat to much bigger than its normal size. Imagine like pumping up a balloon. And when you have thousands and thousands and thousands of people in a mass grave with all of this decomposition and the bloating happening, the ground actually starts to heave so badly that it splits and opens up almost like, sort of those depictions of hell that you see. But of course, coming out of this was the awful stench of rotting, gas-ridden, decomposing bodies. And it was decided at this time that cremation needed to be the only option for disposing of the body. It was also significantly more efficient. What you need to know about cremation is that the cremation ovens were never turned off. Once they were lit in 1942, until the camps themselves were destroyed in 1943, they never went out, and they were in constant use 24/7. The victims of Operation Reinhardt, of course, were majority of them being Jews. There were also, not forget, Polish, German, and Western European Jews amongst the mixed. There were, in some cases, gypsies, Russian prisoners of war, Polish partisans, and communists, but the majority of the people were the Jews of Central and East and Western Europe. As many as 1,000 work Jews were employed in the killing process, which is important to know. They were used as hair cutters, people who extracted gold teeth, and part of the burial and cremation units. Again, very perversely, their reprieve from death seldom lasted more than a few months. They were treated terribly. In fact, any sign of weakness in their physical condition meant that they were killed instantly. Also, as well, the SS, in a really sadistic way, encouraged entertainment with the work Jews. They played football against them, for instance. They made them dance and perform for them at other times. So the sort of sadistic nature of the Holocaust that, again, needs to be stated. A couple interesting notes about the nature of the killers, and we might come across this a little bit later. At Treblinka, the camp commandant, a man named Franz Stangl, who I've talked about in previous lesson, he was a family man, a devout Catholic, but he felt little sympathy for the victims. He said that his work at Treblinka was his profession, that he enjoyed it, and it fulfilled him. His second in command, a man named Kurt Franz, actually this was a man who, generally speaking, gave the speech when people arrived at Treblinka, had been a veteran of the T4 program, and he was a total sadist. That picture on the right is the picture of his dog. His dog was named Bruno. And that dog was trained to attack the genitals of male Jews and not to release the genitals of male Jews until they had been dislodged from his body. So it gives you an idea of the people we were talking about who are running these camps. The results of all of this, by the end of 1942, Himmler's goal of exterminating all the Polish Jews was largely achieved. So much so that the camps actually reduce in the amount of killings that they have by the end of 1942, and it's seen time to close Belzec, which he does at the end of 1942. That is, Himmler orders it closed. Auschwitz's gas chambers had been constructed throughout 1941 and into 1942, and it was seen that any additional Jews that needed to be killed, and that is all of the rest of Europe's Jews, would be sent to Auschwitz, Birkenau, and then of course potentially also Medantic if they were needed as well. But it was basically seen that they had done their job. Operation Reinhardt ended, and by the end of 1943, all Operation Reinhardt camps were dismantled, and painstaking efforts to obliterate every trace was made. If you go to Treblinka, there's almost nothing left. Just under 2 million Jews were killed in Operation Reinhardt, the overwhelming majority of them being Polish Jews. I think something around estimates have about 1.2 million of the Jews killed in Operation Reinhardt were Polish. In November 1943, Himmler thanked Globnik for his work and service to the German people. It concluded Operation Reinhardt, and the final solution then shifted to a second phase where the mass extermination labor centers of Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Medantic would take over. And that in many ways had to do with economic considerations. Operation Reinhardt occurred at a time when the German-Soviet war was really undecided. The killing had a serious impact on the war effort. It had hindered military transportation, it had used up manpower, it had dangerously limited Germany's labor pool. In fact, in 1942, war production was hurt significantly at a time when it could not afford to be by a shortage of labor. German authorities and the general government also started to realize that killing Jews was weakening the German states and the German country economically. Goering and Speer, the two men in charge of the economy, Goering is then actually replaced in 1943 by Speer, begin to appreciate the staggering irrationality of destroying the labor force in the way that it had during Operation Reinhardt. And in fact, the SS, which was well on its way to becoming a state in the state, who owned its own factories, which produced its own armaments and clothing, et cetera, started to even realize itself that they could not run their factories without this pool of Jewish labor, and as such began to start to speak out against Operation Reinhardt. Reluctantly then, there are phases where the extermination program has to give way and slow for economic interests in order to exploit labor in line with the policies agreed at Wannsee. So what we see is a little bit of a shift, and it's important to know that Hitler didn't care whatsoever for the economic considerations of his subordinates, and ordered in the autumn of 1942 that Jews, even doing vital work, were to be evacuated, which essentially meant executed. Nevertheless, in 1941-42, two camps, Medantic and Auschwitz, are created, and they are to serve this dual purpose. They are to be both extermination and labor camps. Medantic was primarily for Poles and Slavs, but also contained a large number of Jews. At any given time, throughout its time in operation, 60,000 to 200,000 deaths of Jews, 60,000 of the 200,000 deaths were of Jews. So you still see a large portion of Jews in Medantic, even though it wasn't necessarily designed for Jews. Auschwitz was. Of the people who die in Medantic, you get 60% of those dying of malnutrition, sickness, and overwork. 15% are shot. The Jews are treated worse, and the rest, of course, would have been gassed. The Jews are treated worse than the Poles and the Slavs. Inflicting cruelty on Jews was semi-official policy, beating them to death, shooting them from the guard towers as target practice, for example. The Jewish death rate is higher than for non-Jews at this camp, significantly, in fact. In November 1943, the surviving Jews there were shot in an operation codenamed Operation Harvest Festival, thus ending the Jewish presence of Medantic. My last slide is sort of to give you an idea geographically of the area we're talking about. You see where Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec are on the sort of eastern side of the government general. Medantic is also in there, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. The camp located closest to Germany is in the southwestern side of Poland, very near the Polish city of Krakow.